Welcome to the AGM 2025 for another Europe is Possible. It's been another very busy year for us as an organisation. We've naturally had a year of change, but perhaps not the year of political hope that we were hoping for in the 2024 general election outcome. I think you can see with this Labour government that it's moving rightwards in some ways in the face of the kind of contradictory demands that it feels or it has put itself up to, put itself under. It's prone in some ways to this kind of corporate capture by quite sectional interests, while at the same time attempting to pursue certainly new progressive policies that we haven't seen for a long time, quite decent public sector pay rises and increase in investment in the National Health Service and new renewables, green transition investment and so on, but is doing so with really vanishingly little fiscal and economic space under those self-imposed fiscal rules, and reluctant really to pull the two big levers that it has at its disposal. One would be a return to the European single market, and the other would be a more far-reaching use of wealth taxes. And I think today we have an opportunity to think about how we respond to that effectively as a campaign and in our activism, and how we hone our arguments. This has also been, as we all know too well, a year of global reaction and global turmoil. 2024 was a historically successful, in quote marks, year for elections, in the sense that more than 2 billion people went to the polls, and incumbents tended to lose on a really quite unprecedented scale, with many voters taking the opportunity to punish incumbent governments, particularly for inflation. Now, that year of what could have been a year of democratic possibility hasn't, of course, turned out that way, because we've seen extraordinary momentum for the far right in many of those elections, encapsulated, of course, by Donald Trump's November 2024 election victory in the US. So international solidarity has remained a really important theme of our work for Another Europe is Possible. Last year, in March 2024, we organised the Think Global Act Global Conference. We've linked up recently with Georgia's democratic revolutionaries fighting for political change there. We've also organised an event last year with France's progressives, talking about how they're challenging the authoritarian centre through those online events. We've also had undertaken really important and I think quite trailblazing work on Islamophobia, and we've taken a delegation of activists to the European Common Space for Alternatives in Marseille. And so that internationalism, trying to break out of the parochialism of the UK progressive scene, if you like, and open up to those international horizons, has been a really important aspect of our work. So today, I think, is a chance to discuss all of these things. I just wanted to mention that, and I'll come back to this later as well. I mean, the National Committee has very recently agreed to support a campaign called People First. That will be launching this week, and it's backed by Ukrainian and Russian human rights activists, a campaign calling for the release of captives of the Russian invasion, particularly Ukrainian civilians that have been willfully and arbitrarily detained by the occupying authorities in their thousands, and kept in horrendous conditions, subject to torture and inhumane treatment. And that's backed by quite a large coalition. So we're pleased to be putting our name to that. In terms of the running order today, we've got two political discussions. I'll shortly be handing over to Alena to chair the first session on confronting the Brexit and Trumpist oligarchy. Then we're going to have another discussion on our migration work and our vision for a rights-based migration policy. Then there's a short lunch break And then we'll be thinking about those political discussions and what they mean for our campaigning work in the period ahead in the strategy and campaigning discussion. So I hope you stay with us throughout today's event. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Alena to run the first session.
Thanks, Luke. Thanks for that comprehensive introduction of today and what we've gathered here to do. I'm very happy to be hosting the first discussion of the day, which is a bit of a get together of the gang in terms of who we're going to hear from. In a couple of minutes, Michael Chessum will join us. I don't think he needs a particular introduction. He's been with Another Europe is Possible from the beginning. And these days he's a published author. His book on what happened with social movements as they joined the Labour Party during Corbyn time and what the impact of that defeat was afterwards has just come out in paperback, so you can check it out. We also have Laura Parker, who is a familiar and beloved face in the Another Europe is Possible family. Laura is part of our national committee, of course, but she's also a dedicated campaigner for democratic reform, among many other hats and interests and political activism that she does. And we will also hopefully be joined by Graham Campbell. Graham is a friend and a comrade in Scotland. He's part of the SNP Socialists group and a local councillor here in Glasgow. We organize with Graham across many causes as well. He's very active in Ukraine solidarity, in anti-racist movements in Scotland and beyond. And I'm hopeful that he will join us, and he will also reflect on the time he spent with the US election. Graham was in the States while voters were going to the polls to try and prevent what eventually was Trump's win, second win. But the experience has definitely taught him interesting lessons about the topic of our discussion. Oh, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Alena Ivanova. I am part of the Another Europe is Possible team as well. I'm also based in Scotland. And I am gathering this illustrious group of people today to talk about the impact of Trump's win, what it means for the democratic alternative that we have always been committed to building as part of our struggle against Brexit, as part of our struggle against the far right here in the UK, but also more broadly. All of these themes of internationalism and solidarity that Luke mentioned in his introduction, they serve a purpose, and the purpose is to build alternatives, a different model of democracy, a different model of decision-making from below. Now, obviously, there is nothing particularly cozy or hopeful in the present moment. But in a sense, we are at the point where we no longer talk about incoming threats. The threats are here. The damage to our democratic fabric is happening. And so what we're faced with is a crisis of organizing, in a way. Our conversation today will touch upon the big topics around oligarchic power and authoritarianism and the capture of the far right of public spaces, social spaces, be it social media or conventional media and press. And we will look at the ground level. What are we doing? How are we changing our approach to people organizing, to coming together, to building these alternatives? So we will talk about the big topics, but we will also be always bringing them back to grassroots level and what we can learn from these moments. And I am going to start with Laura, who joined us first this morning, because she's had the most time to kind of get in the space. Laura, over to you for your initial thoughts, and I'm sure that you'll throw a lot of interesting kind of questions into this space for us to reflect on.
Yeah, hi, thank you. And sorry, I'm looking slightly disorganized. My heating only half works, so I'm actually sitting under a blanket. I'm going to try to inject a little bit of hope into this discussion, but as you say, Alena, I completely agree with you. These are really not easy moments. I was thinking that I was going to be the sort of technocratic and dull bit of this sandwich between the much more exciting Michael and Graham.
Never dull.
I do hope they both arrive.
I'm here.
Excellent. Well, anyway, I've stolen your spot now, so you can only be more interesting than me. But I want to talk a little bit, and I know that we've got people from outside the UK, and I know that our focus, or the focus of many people, is also on things way beyond the UK. And I know that we're not all about elections in the UK, but I do want to talk to begin with about the electoral system. And the reason for that is that I think that for far too long, this has been seen as a sort of slightly technocratic, dull, nerdy end of the political spectrum. It's been a space dominated, I'd say until about 2 or 3 years ago, by people with sort of encyclopedic levels of knowledge about how voting systems work. And we have taken our eye off the ball, and this has suited everyone, including the Labour Party. We've taken our eye off the ball, in terms of what the voting system really means. And rather simply put, we're not getting the governments that we actually vote for. Now, that sounds like a bit of a banal observation, but in the context of the place that we're in, that Alena described, I thought sort of depressingly eloquently, on what's going on in America, we can no longer kind of in good conscience allow, how we vote to be a sort of minor add-on. So I suppose my core call to, if not action, but sort of appeal to how we approach politics going forward, is that we weave in the need for electoral reform in the UK to all of the discussions about everything else that we're having, because actually it's relevant to the discussions that we're having on other issues in the UK. I'm going to give you a little bit of an update on where the electoral reform campaign is at the moment. Before that, and you're probably all very familiar, just to sort of update, where we are electorally. Now, this was the most disproportionate, the 2024 general election was the most disproportionate election the UK has ever seen. You're probably all familiar with the figures, but essentially on the basis of just 1 in 3 votes cast, or 34%, the Labour Party now has 63% of the seats in Parliament. It was also the lowest turnout election since 2001, at 59.7%, and that's only marginally more than the 2001 election. That 59.7% is nearly 8% lower than 2019. And these two things, our voting system and turnout, are obviously closely connected. If you do an analysis, which I will spare you, of turnout in places where seats changed hands, it was higher. And if you look at turnout in seats where smaller parties gained seats, it was also higher. So the biggest upswing in turnouts were in seats where Greens and Reform won, and the lowest turnouts were in areas where Labour won. And I think that 17 of the 20 so-called safest seats in the country actually had the biggest dips in turnout. In other words, people are deciding and instinctively understanding, without burying into all these statistics, that a lot of the time it doesn't count. It doesn't count if you vote. Despite the fact that this was a change election with a significant change of new MPs in Parliament, actually lots of places didn't see any political change. People can also sense that the system is kind of creaking at the seams, so it's failing on its own terms. Now, I think that anyway, its own terms don't make sense, but ostensibly, first past the post brings us stability. Well, that has clearly not been the case for the 14 years under Tory rule, where we had so many prime ministers that none of us can remember. And people are understanding and perhaps again, this is sort of instinctively, although I think we see it with the vote for both the Reform Party and for the Green Party, that this system is sort of fossilizing our political discussion. Now, again, to state the obvious, we can see that the Labour Party's entire policy agenda was, and certainly its comms, because there is a bit of a mismatch in places between its manifesto and what it then said about its manifesto, but broadly speaking, the Labour Party didn't care about much of the electorate. It certainly didn't care about a large part of the electorate that all of we would prioritise: working class communities, communities of people of colour and other marginalised groups who are disproportionately concentrated in urban seats, the very places that Labour didn't really care about winning. Now, it slightly got bitten on the backside with this strategy because, it nearly lost Ilford, for example, not an inner city seat, but, a big city seat. But generally, the Labour Party's entire manifesto and all of its election communications were designed to appeal to swing voters in marginal seats. And we know what that means, and we've seen it since with Labour in government. It means that they keep the two-child benefit cap, because the disproportionate weight of people on benefits in that situation will be poorer communities living in urban centres where their vote is shored up. And they also keep the fuel duty allowance. Why? Because that's the car-owning Mondeo man in a smaller city or town, swing voter in a marginal seat. They talk tough on crime to appeal to those people without really thinking about the significant investment needed in youth services to help us deal with some of the issues, particularly about youth crime. And that the list is endless. We are renewing Trident, which is obsolete because of those marginal voters. So everything about the Labour Party's policy prospectus is it's squeezed by, the fear of 1997, and many of them, of course, still think it's 1997. There are all sorts of other factors, the right-wing ownership of the media, but it's also about the electoral system because they don't need to appeal to most of us. Now, for a very long time, I think all of you have probably instinctively shared this sense, but what we fail to do is articulate like the political implications of this, which are rather crudely put, that the white 55-year-old car-owning, mortgage-paying switcher who reads the Daily Mail in Bolton counts a lot more than the young black woman with 3 jobs living on the Wandsworth Road in South London. And all that follows from that, whether it's about benefits policy, rent caps, or immigration policy. And we have to start to make this fundamental argument about the need to change our electoral system part of our core politics and not the sort of niche preserve of people who want to talk about single transferable votes and vote thresholds. So that's the big picture piece. Just in terms of a quick update on where the campaign is, first of all, perhaps just to explain the architecture of the PR campaign, such as it is in the UK. So I'm a member of Labour for a New Democracy. I'm actually no longer a member of the Labour Party, but Labour for a New Democracy have kindly let me stay. And our focus, as the name would suggest, is on trying to bring change within the Labour Party and the wider Labour movement. We are partnered with the Labour Campaign for Electoral Reform, which is a sort of historical representative of reform in the Labour Party. We have the Green Party doesn't need a sort of Green Party for electoral reform because the entire Green Party is pro-PR, but we work very well with the Green Party and similarly with the Liberal Democrats. I think, but I'm hoping Graham is here or can subsequently explain to us that most of the SNP are pro-electoral reform and they've traditionally been allied to the electoral reform movement. We really, really struggle for Conservatives. We basically don't have that many in the current parliamentary party and the wider sort of membership of the party. And we also work with non-aligned groups, Compass, which is obviously PR is part of its sort of very essence, and then slightly newer organisations like Unlock Democracy and obviously Make Votes Matter. And then there's sort of Electoral Reform Society, which really is more of a think tank, I would probably argue, but is also part of this broad constellation. Labour for New Democracy worked, as you'll probably remember from listening to me ramble on before, But we worked in the last parliament to shore up support for PR within the Labour membership. 66% of constituency Labour parties had policy pro-PR before the boundary changes. 83% of Labour members support PR, according to a YouGov poll. And at Labour Party conference in both 2021 and 2022, the party membership voted for PR. The trade unions didn't vote for it in 21, and we did quite a lot of work. And in 2022, the trade unions came on board. Now, 2/3 of Labour's affiliated trade unions have policy which is pro-electoral reform. Those positions vary. Mick Whelan at ASLIF has been brilliant, exceptional champion of the cause, and ASLIF has a really, really pro-PR policy. And then there are various shades through to the CWU, which has got a slightly more nuanced position about how the current system doesn't work, but they're not yet quite sure how it needs fixing. And Unite, which is very pro PR in its leadership, and its policy is sort of pro-electoral reform, but they did vote for it in 2022. So in terms of their policy, the affiliated unions of the Labour Party are pro-PR. This enabled us in 2023 to get some rather modest wording, but a step in the right direction, into the National Policy Forum policy programme, which said that first past the post is leading to distrust and alienation. Now, that sounds like a minor win, but it's the first time the Labour Party has said that the current system isn't working. And I think the Labour Party's understanding then how that manifested in the 2024 election, because we know that distrust and alienation are the absolute godsend of Nigel Farage and co. The party didn't, of course, make a commitment to electoral reform in its 24 manifesto for all sorts of reasons, which I'm happy to sort of dissect, but you're probably all very familiar. Very cautious manifesto, doesn't want to bite the hand that feeds it on the eve of an election. And whilst the membership of the party is very pro-PR, the nearer you get to the top of the party, the more sort of good old-fashioned Labourism sets in, and the notion that this might be a shitty system, but we can win at it, and a reluctance to therefore change it. So the next part of the campaign, the world that we are now in, having built the base in the party and made big progress with the unions, is really to focus on the Parliamentary Labour Party. We did a lot of work in the run-up to the general election. We have more pro-PR members of the Parliamentary Labour Party than ever before, and not just because we have more people in the PLP. There's a big demographic correlation. You think of someone like the fabulous Nadia Whittome. She's an absolute classic representative of a pro-PR MP because she's not been in Parliament that long and she's relatively young. Essentially, the longer you've been in Parliament and the older you are, the more likely you are to be attached to first past the post. It's got very few active proponents, but because they've been there for a long time and, you know, they're in safe seats, partly they've been there for a long time because they're in safe seats, some of those people are in positions of some influence. But the cabinet has got a lot of people who are, at least were, pro-electoral reform, even though they're keeping it quite quiet. Johnny Reynolds, the business secretary, actually did a private members bill on PR a few years ago, and various others on the record as being pro. David Lammy, Lucy Powell, Wes Streeting. And Keir, classic Keir, is at a slightly ambivalent position, but if he's generally ever said anything about it, he's been more pro-PR than against it. But has sort of repeated the line that it's not a priority and he hasn't got any plans to do anything about it. So the cabinet is being sphinx-like, but generally is the toughest bit to crack. But Parliament as a whole, and this is thanks, of course, to the fact that we've now got 72 Lib Dems and 4 Greens, and I'm sorry there aren't more SNP members to sort of also redress this balance, but Parliament as a whole is more pro-PR than it ever has been. We are working on the detailed numbers. They're obviously hard to get because, particularly on the Labour side, the ambitious don't necessarily tell you what they think about things. But 500 MPs, 70%, come from parties, including the Labour Party, which in one way or another have recognised that the current system is bust. So the Labour Party leadership may not be jumping up and down saying, let's have PR, but its own policy programme acknowledges that first past the post is causing distrust and alienation. And every Labour MP understands that this was the most disproportionate election ever. And increasing numbers of them are starting to understand that they're unlikely to repeat this trick. So this sort of motley crew of campaigners, we've now also teamed up with Open Britain and Fair Vote. And with Fair Vote and Open Britain, Labour for New Democracy and Lib Dems for Electoral Reform, so these 4 organisations, and increasingly Make Votes Matter, we have basically helped set up the new all-party parliamentary group on electoral reform. Well, we've given a better title. We've called it the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Fair Elections. I recommend this report to all of you. I'll put a link in the chat later. And we are, well, we're really, really pleased that it's now the 4th largest all-party parliamentary group in Parliament. The biggest one is on climate. There's another big one on some aspect of the economy. I think it might be tax. I can't remember what the 3rd biggest one is. And then there's ours. That has never happened before. Over half of the membership are Labour MPs. We've had really good discussions. We've produced this really excellent report. And its major ask on the electoral reform side is for a national commission to be called for in this Parliament and to make its findings in this Parliament, and then obviously to change the electoral system. We're not calling for a referendum, don't want a referendum. We think the debate around assisted dying showed that actually if you create space in Parliament, you can have proper discussion, but we don't want this to be a discussion which is just driven by parliamentarians. Obviously, they've got a lot of expert insight, but we also want real experts. Increasingly, we're seeing the real experts coming out for PR. So Rob Ford, who many of you will know, the Professor of Politics from the University of Manchester, he's been a big supporter of the campaign, but others are increasingly making it clear that this system is bust. The guy with the specs from Strathclyde University, John Curtis, Peter Kellner. So we want expert input, and we also want democratic consultation. We want, the people to also have a say on the system, which they instinctively can see as bust. And in fact, a majority of the public now, if you ask them, support changing the voting system. If you ask the public what they think about democratic reform, reforming Westminster and the House of Commons is their #1 priority. It's not the House of Lords. So anyway, we're trying to bring all of this together in a call for a national commission. Finally, and I'm sure we'll have other discussions about this, just to say that because we don't want electoral reform to feel like the outlying nerdy subject, and because we don't believe that electoral reform alone is enough, although we think it's fundamental to unlocking many of the other things that we need to do, the all-party parliamentary group has in fact got 3 sort of core objectives. And after the first past the post one, its second one is about dark money and hidden political influence. So you want to close donation loopholes and strengthen the Electoral Commission, which is a toothless wonder. And the third is about disinformation, because it's all very well and good giving me a vote that counts more or giving 16-year-olds a vote. But if I'm reading utter nonsense online all the time, and that is informing how I vote, then we're only dealing with part of the problem. We can't fix everything that's broken in our democracy through sort of the vote, the voting change alone. So we also want to have much more done about disinformation. There are other parliamentary groups, of course, looking at this, and specifically to require tightening up of the way that harmful content is dealt with online, because there is a big problem with us not requiring media platforms to publish risk assessments about legal but harmful content. So at the moment, illegal content is dealt with, but there's a lot of stuff that flies under the radar that's technically legal but harmful. Anyway, this is a discussion that we might all want to be part of, but just to say that, we are trying to bring these 3 themes together, working with people like Peter Gagan, who used to run Open Democracy, and others who are working on the world of disinformation. So I kind of recommend this report to you. It's really interesting. It's got stats that obviously I can't remember. And it goes into greater detail about donation loopholes and the work on disinformation and what might be done about that. This obviously also touches on the use of social media, X,
I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that as well.
Yeah, exactly. So I kind of dump that in and don't pretend any expertise, but I'm sure others will have views. I hope Dave is here for a start, because I know that he knows a great deal about all of this. And I can't think how long I've talked to, but I will stop talking now.
Yeah, just slightly over the allocated time, but that's absolutely fine, Laura, because I think you kind of stake the ground for electoral reform in ways that are like, there's a very clear, very practical kind of vision that the campaign currently has in the UK. I think it will be really interesting to think about how that will play out, given these notions of stability that you talked about around the existing electoral model, and this disenfranchisement, the sense of disillusionment that people have with the political class. To what extent the UK's diminished role in the global sense of politics is really reflected in that. What I mean is, even if we had a better, more representative electoral system, would that be enough to counter the bigger, more threatening kind of power capture movements we're seeing elsewhere? Like, what's the interplay between these developments on the global scale? And that's why it will be really interesting to hear from Graham Campbell, who is joining us from Glasgow. And Graham was there in the US during the latest election campaign. He has seen on the ground how people engaged with both campaigns, I imagine, with both sides of the argument, and what ultimately led to Trump's election. But I think it would also be really interesting, Graham, if you can reflect on what you saw and what that means for our challenge ahead in terms of building a grassroots movement for democracy. Are there hopeful strands, even in what was ultimately a defeat in the US?
Thank you, Alena, and well, hello everybody, comments, welcome all, and thank you for having us in this conversation. But we're very remiss of me first not to recognise that I'm in the room with a lot of people with political expertise, knowledge, power, and just experience, which I will also recognise from old faces from my days in London. But so hi, Dave Landau, because you're a legendary anti-fascist, and I respect everything I've learned from you all those years ago. I'm applying it now where I am in Glasgow. Just to say that I suppose you see behind me, I've decorated my wall, and I thought I'd give you an idea of what I picked up on the demonstration that I attended in the week after the presidential election, on the first Saturday, the first demonstration against the result back in November. And as you say, it says, New Yorkers stand together, we don't back down. And I think that message of defending migrant rights, this is a demo led by migrants. You know, there was about 10 or so thousand of us walking down 6th Avenue and past Trump Tower and all of that, starting at Columbus Circle. We did our chants, and it was interesting just seeing the reaction that as we were followed by police, and as you'd expect, we were also followed by a very dedicated bunch of Trump supporters who would just dogged the demonstration the whole way down. And it was just interesting, even just chatting to those guys. There was a guy with an eye patch who'd obviously just had a health visit and had an eye surgery or something, but he was shouting loudly with his Trump banner at me, and he targeted me personally towards the end. He said, "Right, open your eyes, guys, open your eyes." And I said, well, if I said the same thing to you, that would be a bit discriminatory. But, you know, it was really impassioned. He was a Cuban, and I spoke to him. He was Cuban, you know, he was black Cuban. So, you know, somebody who's, you know, like me, coming from a minority in that culture. And it was just interesting to see how passionate he was that we lefties and socialists and pro-migrant people trying to stop his guy, Trump, implementing the border policy. He was very passionate. We were wrong about that. Now, somebody like that, it's clearly working class, would have been affected by the ban if he tried to come American now and Trump was in power. Yet people like that are voting for him. And you have to think, well, why? Now, see, in New York, people in New York know Trump, known him for a long time. They know he's a racist and a crypto fascist. They know about him. But why are people like that guy voting for him? And when we visited the United States, we visited before. We've been to New York before, had a great time, enjoyed it. But this year it was noticeable how different it was in terms of the cost of living there. It was extreme. And I think over this side of the Atlantic, while we were excoriating Trump and that movement and expecting that the progressives would win and it would have a natural inbuilt majority, I think we just underestimated the degree of the financial distress that was caused to ordinary Americans in their pockets. For 5 years, they had the collapse that we had because of COVID, right? But we recovered relatively quickly from it. They didn't. Their pockets were still as empty as they were back in 2021, and they associated the poverty that they're feeling. Remember, there was a campaign during the election which Kamala sort of put forward of $15 an hour, right, as one of her key slogans. In fact, the place where I visited, it was a big poster up there. I'll talk more about where we visited, but it was interesting that salary would have taken you 2 hours if you got the $15 an hour. And most people in America who are working paycheck to paycheck are not getting that $15 an hour, nowhere near it. It would take you 2 hours to earn your breakfast money. If you're trying to go into an American diner now will cost you $30 for a decent breakfast. So that's the cost of living you're talking about. A chocolate bar that I buy regularly in Glasgow, I use this as a comparison. I love the Reese's Pieces, peanut butter bar. That costs about $3.50 in my local Glasgow co-op. It costs the equivalent of $5.50 in New York and Washington, D.C. Now, that's ridiculous. It's made there, or rather it's made in Mexico. When Donald Trump puts up his tariffs against Mexico and Canada, that bar will cost even more to import into New York and Washington, D.C. But give you an idea, when we went shopping, we saw people with calculators on their shopping baskets, with their food stamp card in hand, working out by a calculator how much milk they could buy. I saw people putting back a gallon carton of milk and taking down back a pint because they realized they couldn't afford to buy the full amount. I haven't seen people shopping like that in Britain since maybe in the 1980s, the last time I remember seeing people using a calculator. That's how bad it was. Shopping was expensive, and we noticed it. We couldn't afford to do things as tourists the way we could, because Washington, D.C. is one of the most expensive cities in the world. We decided that electorally we would go and help the Democrats in Pennsylvania because we recognized that was where it counted, right? And we went to a Rust Belt town called Jonestown in, I think, what's the name of the county? Cambria County. And Cambria County is your typical Democratic swings county, votes Democrat at the local, in the Senate of Pennsylvania, and votes Democratic for the senators. And in fact, they won on those seats in the election in November, but they lost the presidential by a mile, and they lost it again this time. And it was interesting going around the doors of this town. This is a town which is about equidistant from New York, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh. And many of the people who now live there are people who've evacuated those cities, who still work in those cities, but have to live in Jonestown or Johnstown because that's where they can afford the housing. So that's what these Rust Belt towns are now functioning as economically. They're effectively, new towns, but old towns for refugees who can't afford to live in the urban centres, people who are so low wage that that's where they have to go and live. And it was very noticeable, the demographic change of that town. Previously, that town would have been a mostly all-white steel town. Now it's a very multi-ethnic, multicultural place, but people who are really hard-pressed, who can't afford their gas, who can't afford their heating, and who cannot afford their food bills and are working ridiculous hours to pay for what they do have. And it was noticeable speaking to even, I have to say, some black people on the doors, who were a bit resentful of a foreigner like me coming them and telling them who they should vote for. But even then we're saying, well, Donald Trump's a billionaire. He knows how to handle money. I was richer when he was in office. There was all of that. So like everywhere else in the world where incumbent governments fail to do the economics, it's the economy stupid. the Kamala Harris and Biden government lost the election because of that. I don't think Trump won it. It wasn't that necessarily that people were necessarily convinced by his solutions. They knew that if they didn't change something, it would carry on the way it was, and that carrying on the way it was unacceptable to a large number of working class American voters, particularly white working class ones. However, we shouldn't forget that there is a progressive majority out there. Women, particularly minority ethnic women, overwhelmingly voted for Harris. So did men. People forget that majority of minority ethnic men also voted for her, but there was a definite tide for Trump amongst younger male voters because of their control of social media. There's no doubt that the negative social media messages, particularly anti-trans ones, had real traction amongst Latin American voters. So he got a successful, pushing of the anti-left narrative, particularly amongst people who are from Venezuela or Nicaragua, left-wing countries, and they're refugees from those regimes. So there was a definite pushing of the anti-communist narrative, which had a real traction in the Latin American communities. So there were blocks that, Trump's tactics to build an alliance that was, 72 million voters strong. We can't ignore the fact that people voted for something that was, we would say not in their interest, but they believe it was. Now, if we're looking at internationalism for us and how it affects us in Europe, of course, Trump is a trade warrior, an economic nationalist. He's not a fascist. He is a fascist personally, but the regime we've got, it's comparable, I suppose, with him announcing that amnesty. It's a bit like when Adolf Hitler was released from that insurrection he had in the 1920s, the early one where he got a pathetically low sentence and then was able to write from jail. I think it's comparable to that. We haven't got fascism yet in America, but obviously the emboldenedness of the fascists having been vindicated in their use of violence and murder and threat and intimidation, that is likely to continue over there. And I think the way that Europe and European powers and government respond to that is going to be interesting. Obviously, a lot of them will try and grovel, try and deal. Even over here, Twinney was asked, if he would accept a visit from Trump. Well, of course, nobody can say they won't have Trump visit because he's the president of the United States. But the fact is that his agenda will always be transactional, always be what can we get out of Europe, what can we get out of the Brits, what can we get out of the Canadians and Mexicans, and it's all about economic nationalism. Now, we all know that any tariffs on foodstuffs or trade will always negatively impact working class people. It will always raise prices. We know that from history. These people are not fans of facts, are they really? They just don't deal with facts, or truths about history. So we know what we're dealing with. However, the thing that I can translate all these experiences to is the conversation I had this week in Springburn in my constituency in Glasgow with members of my local community council about the threat of reform and how that reforms, transatlantic access with Trump may have run into some problems. But there's no doubt that the thing that's feeding Elon Musk to support them and to support the AfD in Germany and to support these far-right movements is the same instinct and same movement here. They are trying to divide up whatever resistance we can put up to their program. And the messages that they use and the social media messaging they use are very, very sophisticated in the algorithms, but very simple in the messages. They hit the human feeling, they hit the human heart, the human frustration about things not changing. And it's that I think the left is pretty poor at communicating with, that emotional message that you need to press the solidarity button inside people's hearts with the messaging we have. Yes, we could have the logical argument. We have it in spades. We have all the evidence behind us. The truth and facts back us up on all of these issues. But people who are not so well read as we might be, who don't follow the newspapers or who don't follow the factual channels like all of us follow, we have to think, well, how do those family members of ours, those members of our community communicate? And we had this conversation around the table around, what do we say over the shopping trolley with ignorant people who say something like, oh, well, these immigrants are taking our jobs, or they're causing the queues in the health service, or they're causing the problems in the housing crisis. These are stuff that we all know. We've all seen several rounds of these throughout of our lifetime, of these scapegoating measures coming about. And it's the simple message, I think, that one person said, well, imagine that your granny had been shot at and had lost her fingers. You know, close your eyes, imagine your granny or your nan or your auntie had lost your fingers, been exploited in some way. You wouldn't accept that behavior. Now imagine that they are actually, this wee sweet old Mary is in fact called Samir from Afghanistan, and actually this is their life story. But by telling a simple story like that, which you could rehumanize the experience that refugees and migrants may have experienced, and also reminding, of course, that people in this city are the children and grandchildren of migrants. By connecting with the human story, we were then able to have that normal conversation, that dealing with the things that people were discontent about, but also trying to explain why it is counterproductive to go for the person who's not responsible for creating that situation. We have to have these individual and collective community conversations with people at the granular level. If we don't have those, we will not be able to counteract the propaganda of the machines that we are facing. I think we have to get better at doing that grassroots internationalism from below stuff. We have to create a project, which of course another Europe is doing, of an alternative vision for the future about how Europe and how the world should be. We have to show that progressive politics works. And in America, obviously the 18 states that are controlled by the Democrats have a chance to construct that in resistance to Trump. And indeed, there's possibilities for proper resistance there. Trump's not going to get everything his own way. He's not going to get his whole program through. But here in Europe, we have to really do our best to try and make the project of Europe be, we need to be the harbingers of a progressive politics around that, around public services, defence, around tackling the environment. We have to do all of that from below, and Scotland wants to play its part in that. Of course it does. And the independence question is coming up for us again because we already have a proportional system. We will, these questions will come up in our elections. Of course they will. We will have, I hope, an independence majority so we can continue that conversation about how does Scotland get back into Europe, because we have to get back there. But Europe has to be a progressive project for us to get back into. And we have to see ourselves as part of transforming that project so that it does serve the people. The reason why the main European parties are beginning to lose traction now, partly because they're incumbents, but also that they're not expressing that progressive social Europe as part of their agenda. They're pandering to the nationalists and racists, and we have to be the stalwart defence against that. And I hope that, us in Scotland and our partners here in the AEOP are part of that process of we are the resistance. We won't back down. We're going to stand together.
Thank you very much, Graham. And thank you for bringing these messages as well, even visually into our discussion today. I think really important points around messaging. I mean, it might sound very, very trite, but actually messaging, how you connect with people is really key. And I think we've been telling ourselves this for as long as Another Europe has existed, really. There have been important battles where we've tried to intervene. We've tried to bring the discussion to a grassroots level, to a community level. And I think in some ways we've learned a lot about how to hit that hard spot, the emotional link with people, but also not always successful. Like our message doesn't always reach the people we need it to reach. And so there's a lot that we still need to kind of try and do that. But we're now going to go back to Michael, who was supposed to give us the opening to this conversation. Instead, he's gonna close it. And I'm really keen to hear from Michael about where do you think we are at with social movements? What important changes have happened given Trump's election, but not only, given this kind of almost the default position of incumbents are losing across Europe, but also the Labour Party kind of started losing the argument even before it got in government. So where does that leave us in terms of how we do organising now? Obviously, what we've tried before, it's built some links, some networks, but it hasn't been enough. So where do we go now, Michael? Wait, did Michael just disappear off my list?
I think so. Try to spotlight him, but it's not working.
This
Sent a message saying that his phone has overheated.
This is perfect timing indeed. Sorry.
We broke his phone.
Yeah, I think we have. Right. Oh, I haven't seen that. Oh yeah. Okay.
Would you like somebody to make a few comments about the position of the Labour Party until Michael's phone is ready?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps let's start the discussion part, and then we'll bring Michael back in.
Okay, fine. Well, I'm Sandy Martin. I'm a member of the Labour Party. Was a member of Parliament. I'm still a member of the Labour Party, so I think that it is sensible to have some sort of Labour Party perspective on this. But I'm not a member of the Labour Party that is 100% supportive of every position that the leadership is currently taking. You will be very pleased and not particularly surprised to hear. I think that the most important aspect of the election of Donald Trump in the United States, which relates directly to what's happening in this country, is the creation of fake news. I absolutely agree with almost everything that has been said by Graham, but I do think that we need to be really, really focused on how difficult it is to have any sort of progressive politics when the voters have absolutely no idea who is telling the truth, what the issues are, and what the consequences of voting for one person rather than another person might be. And what Graham was describing absolutely epitomizes that. You know, we've had people of color, we've had gay people, we've had immigrants, we've had all sorts of people voting for Trump without any real conception of what that consequence might be for them, which is why the issues that were raised by Laura in the third part were so important. We have got to deal with the issue of fake news and the way that social media is creating complete misunderstandings of everything that there is to understand. And of course, the money behind that. It's not just about the money behind the creation of the messages, it's also about how they are promoted. So if you are promoting messages on social media, the more money you've got, the more you can actually project those messages into people, whether they want them or not. And the third thing, obviously, is not just reflecting the way that people vote, but actually creating the space for honest political parties to operate. At the moment, we don't have that space. And of course, they've got that space even less in the United States, where it is absolutely a two-party system. Unless people can tell the truth and have some expectation of getting some people elected when they tell the truth, then you are not going to get honest politics, and you're not actually going to get a choice that people can accept. And the choice between the Democrats and the Republicans in the United States was not a good enough choice for enough people who needed that choice to be a progressive party to be able to make that choice at all, or indeed to know which way to make that choice. So we're working within the Labour Party to try and get that done. Whether we will succeed, I do not know. And it is perfectly obvious and becoming more obvious day by day that there are quite a lot of people in the Labour Party who want us to be more like the United States and not more like progressive European countries. And so we've got a lot of fighting to do. How long I can carry on doing that, and how long the rest of us in the Labour Party are doing that fight to carry on, I leave to your imagination. But anyway, I'll shut up there because I expect Michael is ready now.
Yes, Michael is back. But these are very important points, Sandy, I think, especially around, you know, the basics around like the space that money opens up for political messaging, and how our kind of public spaces are manipulated through power grab of technology, really. Over to you, Michael. Good to see you.
Hello, and I'm very, very sorry for dropping off. My phone overheated, so I had to switch to another phone very, very quickly. I think the first thing to... Sorry, go ahead.
No, go on.
No. I think the first thing to say is that things are very bad. And I think we have Trump's election. Meloni is in power. Le Pen is on the rise. The AfD is going to come first or second in the next German elections, and who knows if they'll be kept out of government. Iberia, which is where I currently am. I'm speaking to you from a hotel room in Barcelona. The far right is very much present in a way that, you know, we used to talk about the Iberian exception to the far right, the rise, and that is without even beginning to talk about the old Eastern Bloc or India or South America or so on. And on top of all of that, we have climate change, which is obviously an integral part of the far right's rise, not just in terms of how we deal with action on climate, which I think could sometimes come across as a bit amorphous and intangible, but especially in terms of migration. I mean, in a sense, what the climate crisis means is that by the middle of this century, hundreds of millions of people are going to be climate refugees. That is baked in, and there are two ways that you can handle that. Either you can completely transform our domestic debates on immigration, or you can murder people in one of the greatest crimes against humanity that the world has ever seen. And really, a lot of the far right's rise and the dehumanization of migrants and so on that we're seeing now is their answer to that. They understand that on some level, as somebody said on a Vox, sort of reflected in a Vox pop on the BBC recently, we will have to have hearts of steel to deal with that situation. And to a great extent, this is about the political system adapting to that moment of mass migration. So a lot of this speech could be really, really obvious, and I'm going to try not to be really, really obvious. Instead, I'm going to try to do two things. One is talk about why this Trump moment is different to the Trump Brexit moment, and why it's much more dangerous. Why, secondly, that requires a shift of thinking by our bit of the left, and a change to the implicit long-term attitude that I think many of us have had towards the political centre and towards social democracy and saving it from itself, and then what we might do about it. So we're used to saying that neoliberalism let the far right in, and obviously that's true. You know, for many, many decades, politicians of the centre and indeed the centre left in the UK and elsewhere have gone along with the neoliberal policy of deregulation, privatization, etc., and essentially Thatcherism here, and spent that period driving down wages and living standards, while also drip feeding poison about migrants and minorities into society. And funnily enough, if you do that for 40 years, the far right turns up and it kicks your ass, and that is basically what has happened to the political centre. But I think it's important to go a lot further than that. That on a deep level, I think a lot of the left Remainer world, including us, and including at least many of us, wanted to believe on some level that where this was all heading was that the centre left might hold, that we might save social democracy from itself, and that we might be the ones to give it the ideas it needed and chivvy it along and give it the tools. And that might have been the outcome of our efforts. And that felt kind of right during the Trump Brexit moment, 2016, 2017, and indeed right the way up to the defeat of Jeremy Corbyn and indeed the first defeat of Trump. A kind of grand coalition of the social forces of the centre left, and the left. And sure, we talked about radical government, and we meant it. You know, Corbyn was on the table, and we fought for that. And we talked about how the centre didn't have the ideas and we were going to give them to it. But really, we were talking about an alliance there, in a fundamental sense. And after all, wasn't that what Corbynism really represented? A kind of a restatement, a basic return. So really basic social democratic measures that 40 years ago, and indeed all over Europe now, are the norm, with a bit of social progressivism on the side. And isn't that really what the Greens represent, perhaps in a slightly purer sense? We don't live in that timeline. And I think that's the fact that has changed in the years since the pandemic, and that crystallized in my head with the second election of Donald Trump. And I don't just mean that in the sense that the centre's moment is fading. I mean, it's kind of old news that Biden and Macron and Starmer will fail electorally. I mean that in the sense that the centrist and liberal establishment, and in many cases the whole of the centre left, have made a choice about a political choice and a policy choice. Macron is fully accommodating the far right's rhetoric on loads of issues. Olaf Scholz is engaging in the biggest round of mass deportations in Germany's recent history. Thank God we got rid of Law and Justice in Poland, and he was replaced by the liberal pro-European Donald Tusk, who has banned the right to claim asylum. And I think, in a way, it's very what strikes me most about the period around the inauguration of the second inauguration of Donald Trump is how little discussion there really is of what the far right is actually doing. Beyond saying, "Oh, the lies, isn't it debasing, undermining our politics?" But actually relatively little commentary along about the policy detail of Trump, and largely that's because there's so much of it. He's banned refugees to an extent. He's deployed the military along the border. He's ended the birthright for migrants. He's withdrawn from WHO and Paris. He's undertaken a load of really dark stuff on trade and workers' rights, which, by the way, isn't getting enough attention because the media cycle isn't focused on it. He's banned gender recognition, and that list goes on and on and on. But instead of talking about that, we are stuck in a conversation about semiotics and symbolism. What is the number one thing that has dominated the news cycle since Trump's inauguration? It's not what he's doing. It's the angle. It's the angle of Elon Musk's hand. It's kind of this symbolic discussion, which I think liberals are very, very bound to and very, very prone to. Is this but very, very little discussion of the substance. Why is that? Well, partly it's because the far right is very, very good at this stuff. It's a very, very astute comms machine. Look at the shiny, shiny, horrible thing. Look at the outrageous thing. Now don't focus on what we're actually doing. But to an extent, it's also because of the way that the centre deals with these things. It's like when Geert Wilders won the Dutch elections a few years ago, and there was a lot of commentary in places like the Times and the Guardian going like, "Oh, when are we going to get the British Geert Wilders?" And it was like, we've already had the British Geert Wilders for like a decade. They've been in power. Like the British version of Geert Wilders is in power. At the time, the Conservative government's policies on migration were the envy of the far right across Europe. They went further than Geert Wilders was planning to do in office. And why is it that we don't talk enough about that substance and instead talk about the symbolism? Well, it's because actually we have a centre and to an extent, a great extent, a centre left that is determined to keep those policies. Starmer has kept the overwhelming majority of the consensus established by the far hard right. I'm not going to call them far right because we'll get into a silly definitional discussion. But has kept a lot of those policies. And what are we compensated with? We're compensated with the fact that he's got rid of the big symbolic one, Rwanda. So we've got rid of the big symbolic one, And that's kind of okay, because these people inhabit a world of comms first politics. Just like the far right does, they inhabit a world of social media cycles and news cycles and playing that game. And for them, the symbolism matters more than the substance. But on the substance, why is that? What, you know, that underlying stuff is all being left intact on migration, on the Cass review, on transphobia. And why is that accommodation happening in such a coordinated way? Well, it's because the ruling class, a substantial proportion of the capitalists who actually run our economy, have made a decision to accommodate the far right in a much, much deeper and open way to what they did in 2017. This is no longer a bad dream. This is reality, and they are adapting like all good business people would. We talk about the far right capturing our institutions. What's actually happening is that our institutions, the people in charge of our institutions, are holding open the door, beckoning in the far right and saying, please come in, we'll work with you as honest brokers. And I think that accommodation is what is going to define this moment. So what do we do? I think a corollary of the fact that this is happening a second time is this kind of desensitization. The fact that it is much harder to get people up in arms about all of this stuff now than it was. It's a barrage. And the thing about desensitization is that you can't get over that by force of will. You can't just show up to people and say, you really should be jolly well more angry about this. That doesn't do much. You can't hope that they're resensitized and suddenly find their morale back. But what we have to do is find flashpoints to mobilize around where things do cut through. But really what we need is a longer term project to give people agency back. And because that is really what people lack here. How many minutes do I have?
Let's say wrap it up in 3 minutes.
Okay. We live in a moment of contradiction, in the sense that neoliberalism ran much deeper in Britain than it ran in our European neighbours. We went much further in terms of privatisation, in terms of deregulation, and in terms of the consensus, in large part, by the way, because of our electoral system boxed out any alternatives. And that means, on the one hand, the ruling class is overextended. The right-wing economic consensus that has dominated our politics is so unpopular, and the political establishment lacks any self-righting mechanism. It kind of feels incapable of going back on that. And so demographically, and there's a secular process of radicalization, especially a generational process of radicalization, whereby left generations are being won over. And I think it's important not to overstate the whole youth far-right social media stuff. It's happening in pockets. There is a polarization happening, especially amongst young men. But generally speaking, the generational trend is left, especially in Britain. It is left. And that is a cause for optimism. But on the other hand, the very same process, the deep experience of neoliberalism, turned our institutions to mush, demolished the trade union movement, meant that the Labour left was mush, and we didn't do ourselves any favours with the outcome of Corbynism, with having no institutional legacy. But what's happening in those two is that we are in a race. We're in a race between us and the far right. Starmerism is going to fail in office. And we are in a race to build our own institutions and build our own movements before the far right can take power. I don't have time to talk in detail about what that might look like, but as a list.
Yes, we love a list.
As a list, I don't think that rebuilding of the left is going to take place by some kind of pro-European anti-far right movement. It's going to take place because of an organic rebuilding of the left. It's going to take place because of industrial and social struggle against the Starmer government in the immediate term. And there's lots to be optimistic about there. The recent cost of living strikes are the biggest strikes this century, and so on. But it's going to be a case of building unity across class lines between the Labour left, the Green Party, and the New Left projects. And it's going to be a case of rebuilding our institutions, and rebuilding those institutions on the basis of class politics, democracy, both within those institutions, within the economy, and crucially within politics itself, when we talk about things like electoral reform, and which institutions which are committed to confronting the far right's politics head on and not accommodating them. And that, to end, is where I think Another Europe is Possible is still essential, and the work that we do is still essential, not just because it provides a political home for those of us who believe in that vision, but because it, you know, and that all sounds really obvious, but anybody who was active in Momentum, anybody who's active in Mélenchon's projects currently will be able to tell you democracy, pluralism, a commitment to migrants' rights, and a total opposition to the far right's narratives is not an easy thing to win within the left. And those divisions within the left will come to the fore, and it's essential that we exist to do that. Not just for that moment, but obviously in the next year, we may well have some kind of flashpoint around Britain's relationship to Europe. So I'm sorry for banging on for so long. I'm sorry for being 5 minutes late, and I'm sorry that my phone overheated just before I was about to come on. But yeah, it's not so much a rallying call, but
no, not at all. I think I disagree. I think it very much is, because we now have a few hours ahead of us to delve into some of these areas of work that you very eloquently, if a bit depressingly, outlined. And we are going to talk about migrants' rights and also organizing, and where that intersects with like industrial organizing as well in the next session with SEMA. And we are going to talk about further along in the day our plans for the year, and our plans for the year very much center around how we respond to this very different time that we live in, because I think it's very true that we're not seeing a reiteration of a moment. This is a different chapter now. I think I have 8 minutes remaining from my allocated time for this session. So I would be very keen to hear from you guys with any kind of thoughts and reflections on what we just talked about, but be mindful that there will be time throughout the rest of the day where we will be coming back to these themes. So if you can't, if we don't have time now in this first session, we'll definitely have time for thoughts and questions and responses. And indeed, lots of conversation is already happening in the chat anyway. So does anyone want to say something to respond to what Laura, Graham, and Michael just outlined about our present challenges? Seema.
Thank you, and thanks to all of the speakers, because that was a really, really interesting beginning of this AGM. I had a question, and it was a bit about analysis, because I feel like the rise of the far right and the move of the institutions towards actively welcoming the far right, as well as the move of the ruling classes, the oligarchies, to also actively funding and supporting the far right, to what extent is that also a response to those kind of more insurgent movement-y kind of left campaigns that we had with Bernie Sanders, with Corbyn, with Mélenchon in France now, all of them with their flaws, obviously. And I have my own critique of whether these kind of movements even have the built-in capability to maintain power, if they even manage to win it through the existing electoral system. But in some sense, I do see this rise in far right as a reaction to that. I also see it as a reaction to this global mobilization we've seen around Palestine, where there is also this generational difference. I think when we're analyzing it, I think there is like the campist, anti-campist way of looking at things, but I think it also goes beyond that as well. And so in some ways, as we start mobilizing, we probably need to expect more reaction and more support for the far right. And so my question kind of is it all just a history of failure, or is there something that we should build on and which needs to be ready to meet the challenges of a system that's skewed to make sure that we do not win?
Is that for everyone, Seema, or is that for?
Yeah, for everyone. Yeah.
Okay. And I think the second person that wanted to speak was also Joseph Healy, and then we can go back for very quick reflections from the speakers.
Yeah, just a quick point on Michael's comment on the generational trend. It's certainly true that the generational trend in Britain has been generally to the left, but certainly not in France or Germany or a number of other European countries. And the role of TikTok there has been central. I mean, the French Rassemblement have used it very effectively. The AfD have used it, and Trump has even thanked TikTok for his victory. So, you know, we talked about social media earlier. A leftist Italian said to me a few years ago, the left is so many years behind the right in terms of this sort of communication. That was a big issue.
Thanks, Joseph. Again, noting that we will continue discussing throughout the remaining sessions, and especially when it comes to our plans for the year. So I'm going to go back to Laura and Graham and Michael now, but then we'll definitely hear from all of you.
Can I make a request that
yeah,
that we hear from the person who's next indicated as my colleague from Scotland.
All right. If it's someone from Scotland, I'm going to take an executive decision and give them the mic. If you want to unmute now. So,
sorry, I've been on Teams so much, I'm not used to so many.
Oh no.
There, and some of the things alluded to, I mean, like, you know, media and knowing, you know, what's real information. When we see that and, you know, the right Farage and whatever, and, you know, with Putin and Russia, the sort of sowing of disinformation, and that, you know, nobody really knows what is correct, what's, you know, the truth anymore. Everyone is just as bad as each other. So, you know, that's the sort of narrative that we need to sort of counteract. But I think as well, I mean, there's a bit of human psychology as well that is acting against us. You know, it's kind of maybe hard to try and get people to realise that, you know, that their issues are as a result of, you know, 5 decades of neoliberalism and various structural issues and transfer of wealth and whatever. It's so easy for somebody to believe that my problems are because of that foreigner taking my job or taking up places at school. So that's a sort of, you know, narrative that, you know, we've got our work cut out to try and counter. But I think as well, I mean, certainly in Britain, probably in America too, I mean, the fact that, you know, both main parties have had so little to distinguish between them, they've basically accepted the narrative of neoliberalism that's been, you know, dominant in the last few decades. So the only thing really that's standing out to counter that is the populist far right. You know, there's no real left alternative being articulated, you know, for people really to latch onto. But those were just the couple of points I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thanks. And I'm really sorry, but because you appear as just M. Grant, I'm not sure what your first name is, so I don't know how to.
Sorry, it's Murray.
Murray. Okay. Thank you very much, Murray, and happy to have you in this space today. I am going to go back to the speakers now for very much kind of whistle tour response round, and then we're going to go into the next session. Take it away, Laura.
I'm not sure I've got any particularly astounding summarizing thoughts, really. Can I pass and potentially reappear at a later stage?
Of course you can. Yes.
I did have one thing I sort of wanted to ask Graham, that Graham may want to talk about something completely different. Was about, well, it's about how people now going to regroup. Did you come away, Graham, with us, you know, that there was obviously fight going into the election, but how much of a sense of fight coming out of it did you come away with?
It's a good question, and it relates to what Michael was talking about as well. You can't just turn up to people and say, now you stay angry or get more angry.
Yes, just to comment on the American thing I think you're referring to, obviously the pro-migrant groups were the first to sort of get on the streets and resist for some obvious reasons. But there was also the circle of Kamala Harris supporters, you know, all the ones that you saw mobilized online particularly, and those networks have continued to obviously a much diminished extent, but they are still happening. So that debate is still happening within the left of the Democrats. AOC is in particular quite loud in this process in terms of resisting Trump's government. So you know, the resistance idea is very strongly there amongst Democrats, but I don't think they've fully learned the lessons. There is still that, you know, Democrats blaming themselves for being too left-wing on one hand, because that's nonsense, of course. It was because they weren't left-wing enough, but then the others are saying they weren't left-wing enough and to respond to the populist demands that workers had, that they could have responded to, and they didn't do enough to address. So that discussion is strongly going there amongst activists, and obviously it can't agree with itself. So inevitably, the Democrats are going to split around how far, you know, what level of resistance they can have to the Trump administration. So I think that's going to be one of the problems. But I think to address some of the points that Michael's raised about the need for social democracy, well, we do have one outlying example in Europe of a left-wing government that has resisted austerity measures, that has in fact kept things like free higher education, free prescriptions in the NHS, limited, renationalized railways, paid its public sector workers properly so that they didn't go on strike in the time that you were having the strikes in England. That's Scotland. We are an outlying democracy because we're a proportionate representation in which the vast majority of the voters have voted for social democratic and left parties. You know, so we have the Labour Party and the SNP and the Greens make up the overwhelming majority of the parliament. We have a pro-independence majority. And given what Starmer has been doing in the last 6 months, alienating the very people that voted for him with all the measures that he's taken, that support for independence has suddenly swung right back. If there was an election tomorrow, the SNP and the Greens between them would have a clear majority again. That obviously we can't take that for granted, because also coming with that is the reform reaction as well. So that, you know, it looks clear that there's a polarizing, certainly, but that kickback for reform is way smaller in Scotland because the hostility towards migration is way less, because we've had, you know, 25 years of essentially a progressive, consensus about the need for more people to come to the country. Tories have broken that recently by, with the new leadership there and having to be under pressure from the right from reform. So that is having an impact on the debate now. So we are being impacted now by the racist debate that we're seeing. So we're not immune from it, but we have the ability to fight back because there is a social democratic consensus in the society and a pro-independence majority, and that independence movement is back, and it's being restored. And I suspect that the whole process of what do we do in elections coming, that will be part of that discussion. So we do have some hopeful things, because it's clear the public supports the policies that have been defended. You have an example not far away from you where not following the neoliberal diktat works. It works electorally, it works politically, and of course it helps and shapes the lives of ordinary people to fight poverty. It's essential that anywhere the left is a movement on the streets and a movement in government, that the two are connected with real policies that deliver for people. It is very practical that unless the majority of people in Scotland see that pro-independence in Europe is in their personal, familial and community interests, obviously they won't vote for it, but clearly they don't like the status quo. So that's what's driving the shift towards independence and towards independence in Europe. So I give that as my caveat to the overall explanation, which I agree with, which is we are in dark times, and the need to have a progressive movement down in England is essential. We need to work out ways of doing that, and we obviously have to be supported to that in Parliament. The SNP MPs are part of the grouping with the Independents, with the Labour left, and everybody that we can work with down there to put progressive messages out there. We need to work really closely together as far as we can to do that.
Thanks, Graham. And obviously, we're not immune from the threats of reform and the likes up here in Scotland. So we have to stay on the case as well. But over to Michael for final thoughts and in the last minute that I have for this session.
Well, you can read all about how Scotland had a slightly different strike experience of the cost of living strikes in the brand new Chapter 7 of This Is Only the Beginning, which came out yesterday. There you go.
I did plug it in my introduction while you were not even in the room yet.
I know. Yeah, I don't have a huge amount. I mean, look, on Scotland, I guess, let's see how deep this exceptionalism runs. It is going to be interesting to see what happens to the reform vote in Scotland. I mean, I'm not for a moment accusing anyone of complacency. I know Graham is and the SNP Socialists in general are serious and have a very, you know, they know the risks. But I think yeah, it would surprise me if Scotland is obviously not an innately centre-left nation, and there are various contingent factors that are holding it in that position. One of which is having an electoral system that actually works, but many others of which are the national question and so on, which have contained a lot of the politics. I mean, yeah. So yeah, let's see at the next elections. I think Labour will do terribly in Scotland at the next elections. So I think the SNP will survive, but yeah, well, who else will be in that parliament? I think things might be a little grimmer than we imagine. So I suppose the only thing I was going to react to was Seema's thing, which is like, in a way, is this a classic moment where you know, in a sense, the question is how much is a classic understanding of fascism useful for understanding our current moment? The centre left is the centre and centre left accommodating the far right is kind of a classic thing that they do. It's what they did in the 30s. And they did it in response to the fact that they were more scared of the communists than they were of the fascists. In a sense, that, like, is it the case that the centre is accommodating the far right because they're more scared of figures like Corbyn and Mélenchon and Podemos than they are of the far right? To an extent, but I don't think we should. I think we've got to be aware that we are in a much more, like, the left is a lot weaker now than it was then, and both here and across the Western world. And to an extent, I think there's a little bit more of the psychodrama within the centre itself. There's something very deep about the neoliberal consensus and the way that financial capitalism has captured the minds of these people, that it wouldn't cost them very much actually to accommodate to a social democratic program. You know, we're not talking about them using using the far right as a block to, you know, a revolutionary program and the overthrow of their entire economic system. We're talking about them, you know, accommodating the far right as an alternative to mild social democratic reform. And that, I think, is quite different. And I think you can't necessarily understand just in terms of, oh, of course, the capitalists will accommodate the far right before they accommodate the left. I mean, that's true, and they will, you know. And I certainly think that that's a lot more naked now than it was in the second Trump presidency than it was in the first. You know, there was this moment, and the anti-Brexit movement is kind of a part of this, where like a large proportion of the centre right is kind of in revolt against the kind of far right drift of the Conservative Party and against the far right drift of politics in general, and ends up buddying with the centre and centre left. What will happen to those forces is that they will either accommodate to their own the kind of mainstream drag of the Conservative Party, which is to accommodate the far right, or they will just become totally marginalised. And so I think we will see a much more kind of classic formation of politics in that sense. But I am wary of simply replaying, the fascism of today is not going to look like the fascism of the 1930s, and in part that's kind of like what is so clever about about Musk's Nazi salute, is that it's it's kind of a look at the big shiny thing that you seem to be really scared of and that you can immediately understand. But actually the fascism that they're going to introduce is not going to look like that. It's going to look like mass online surveillance. It's going to look like a privatization of the infrastructure of the state. And yeah, so the playbook, I saw a comment come up at the bottom saying the playbook. By all means, let's work to the playbook. The playbook in terms of the analysis we have of what capitalists will do when confronted with a challenge to their class interest is absolutely true, but don't be drawn in by the aesthetics of that playbook. Things will look and feel different, even if their content is politically the same.
Great, thanks, Michael. I am handing over to Seema now, very late and behind time. Sorry about that, Seema. That's what happens when you give me charge of the first session.
No problem. So we're going to go straight into this session, and so we won't have a little break. Is that what we're saying?
If you want to have a little break, up to
okay.
you.
Okay, cool. So I'm just going to try and spotlight myself. Okay, so thank you, everyone. We're going right into the next session. This is called Europe Beyond Borders. What's our vision for rights-based migration policy? Now, I know we've been talking a lot about the doom and gloom, but we are trying to posit alternatives. And without positing alternatives, without building alternatives, that is the abandonment of hope. And we've got to keep going. So this is about trying to think about what we can do to push back against the so-called doom timeline. So we have an exciting lineup of speakers for you today. Before we hear from them all, I'll just give a brief outline of what this session is about. We've already been talking a lot about Trump, about Starmer, how actually there's almost a continuation of hard policies on migrants, a capitulation to fascism, or the far right or the hard right, whatever you'd like to call it, and not getting into a debate about those terms. One of the examples of this was in the election campaign last year when Keir Starmer sparked outrage when he singled out Bangladeshis as illegal immigrants that needed to be deported. And this line was actually repeated by his shadow cabinet minister, Jonathan Ashcroft, who said on Victoria, Derbyshire, that there were too many migrants from India, Bangladesh and Albania, and said, we're gonna send people back. He then promptly lost his seat because his constituency actually has a high number of Indian and Bangladeshi diaspora. And Shaukat Adam, an independent who was a little-known optician from the local Leicester community, has replaced him. But as soon as Labour got into power, they went overdrive on immigration raids and deportations. And as Michael said before, they got rid of the big distracting policies that the Tories had, like the Rwanda policy or the barges. But they are actually more ruthlessly efficient in deporting people now at the moment. And the way that they're doing this is in a way that it's less likely to be challenged under the Human Rights Convention. But despite that fact, we have other examples where people are pushing back on this. So in Spain right now in the parliament, there's legislation that's making its way through to regularize 300,000 undocumented migrants. So it's not a picture of total far-right policies dominating. There are pockets of resistance and change. And I think we need to hold on to those and show them as an example. Now, looking at Europe as a whole, we've had for decades, as we discussed in the last session, terrible policies on migrants. If we think back to 2015 with the so-called migration crisis, that was actually about hundreds of thousands of people from Syria who were fleeing civil war. And we're now also seeing what they were actually fleeing. Like all of those pictures are coming out since Syria has been liberated from the rule of Assad. And I think that there's a bit of a disconnect in the discourse where migrants, refugees are actually just totally dehumanized. We don't hear their stories. And when people do hear their stories, I think that is that kind of emotional, motivating missing link to connecting the reality of migration as something that's a basic human right, where people are fleeing, horrific situations. One of the things that I think is really important as well is to talk about racism and where that comes from. You might hear a lot of people talking about racialized people rather than, people of color. And the reason we use that word racialized is actually because race itself is a concept that was invented during the colonial period. People aren't inherently from one race or another. And I think that this is a really, really important element to understand that this is a colonial construct. And it comes from race scientists and anthropologists who wanted to justify white supremacy and colonization. And I think that also is an important part of the discourse on migration that we don't really hear enough. And there's an intentional erasure of colonization and its impacts in mainstream media because, again, we don't want to humanize migrants and understand why people are moving. For me, as someone who comes from the Bangladeshi diaspora, that's been, for me, it's always been part of my consciousness as to why people from my family have migrated from Bangladesh to the UK. And it's obviously because the economic system has forced people from many countries to live in a state of dependency on former colonizers. And Oxfam recently just released a report to show that there was $64.82 trillion was drained from India by the UK during colonial rule. And so that amount of stealing of wealth isn't just going to disappear because Britain withdrew its troops from these places, right? It continues. And I think that's something that we do need to bring into our analysis a bit more on this area. Now, without taking up too much time, I'll move to our first speaker, who is Fatma Moulay. Fatma is an activist and human rights defender from Western Sahara. She's currently working as Ujsario's international coordinator, and she'll talk to us a bit about the situation where the EU has actually externalized its border policies with the deal with Morocco, for instance, and how this actually plays into climate crisis and how human rights in Morocco are actually being totally undermined by this policy as well. So over to you, Fatma. If Fatma's there, I'm just checking. Oh, I think she's not here.
She just dropped out. Maybe it's a technical issue.
Okay, this seems to be happening quite a lot. So we can go over to Zoe, who'll talk a bit more about what's happening in the UK and the EU, but ideas about how we can actually build a strategy for migrants' rights. And Zoe is an independent campaigner and researcher on the right of all migrants and a longtime member of the AEIP-NC. Over to you, Zoe.
Thank you, Seema. I did see Fatma on the call earlier, so hopefully she can just pop back in afterwards. But happy to start. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me as part of this really interesting and important discussion today. I think actually that panel that we just heard from was a really good introduction to a lot of what I want to say. I'm going to try to be slightly less depressing than Michael. That is my benchmark. If I depress you less than Michael, then I've done okay. Not that Michael's not right, obviously, and I think that it is important to acknowledge that we are currently, I mean, in terms of the struggle for equal rights for migrants, in one of the worst and most difficult times, well, I've ever lived through, for sure. And it's not going to be pretty over the next few years. And it is really easy. I've been really sick the last week. Like I have really nasty flu, and I'm telling you that, like, don't read the news if you're unwell. I mean, I've been swinging between like a really, really deep level of despair and then this sort of like angry defiance that tends to push me forward in my usual life. And I'm luckily feeling way better today, and I've swung back a little bit towards the anger and defiance and the feeling that, you know, yeah, things are shit and that's why we've got to do something. So hopefully I'll keep myself and also you guys in that, on that side of the pendulum of despair, but no promises. So I'm going to focus mainly on the UK, but also within the context of Trump's victory and what's going on in the US, because I think that there is a very evident and concerted effort from the right-wing media, right-wing commentators and the far right of UK politics to import the Trumpist politics that have been successful, rhetorically successful over there in recent times. And we're seeing a lot more pushing of a narrative around deportations, and that's in the UK and it's across Europe as well. And this ties into the overwhelming narrative that we have in our media that is focused on numbers. And I think that that's where our first problem springs from, which is that where we're having a conversation about numbers, then the debate in the media is very, very firmly positioned as one of more numbers or less numbers, higher numbers or lower numbers. So, you know, there's the lower numbers side, which is very well represented by all the usual people that you can think of. And then we, as people who care about the human rights of migrants and about systems that function well for everybody in our society, we're positioned as therefore being on the higher numbers side, which I don't think anybody probably in this room really recognizes themselves in. I am not somebody who is pro more immigration just because. I am somebody who campaigns for the rights of migrants, regardless of their number, pretty much. And I think that that is one of the major areas of weakness that we have, which is that we cannot control this mainstream media narrative that puts the debate on terms that are just not our terms, that are not the question that we either have an interest in answering, or frankly, that it benefits us to be engaging with at all, because the numbers really, really doesn't help as a frame for us at the current time. There's an interesting conversation to have that maybe we can get into when we're sort of planning things, is that the forthcoming migration statistics for the UK are going to show a very, very, very significant drop-off from the historically high net immigration figures that we've had over the last couple of years. That's driven by the fact that most of the people coming from Ukraine have already come. Most of the people coming from Hong Kong have already come. Each of those contributed around 200,000 people over the last few years. And then there's also been changes to specifically care worker visas, which was the other biggest group represented within the high net immigration figures over the last few years. And applications for those visas have dropped off a cliff. I mean, I'm talking like dropped off by like 90% in the last year. So we're going to see a very significant drop in that too. And those three groups combined dropping off very significantly is just going to mean that the net immigration figures are going to be much, much lower in the next few months to a year than they have been previously. And I think there is a question over whether there's an opportunity there to reframe the debate, or whether Labour could take an opportunity there, like claim that as a win and then pivot to a more humane immigration policy as a whole. I don't know, but I don't want to dwell too much on that, although I'll come back to the question of like our lack of power in setting the narrative at the end, if I stick to my plan. So I think what Michael said about the difference between the debate we're having about symbols and the actual underlying like processes and systems and what they actually do is really, really important. So that we focus on a performance around certain like key trigger elements, specifically the boats, the Rwanda plan, and so on. And we talk much, and the numbers also would go into that, I think, which it does constitute a bit of a performance of these big release of like, the stats are here, the stats are this, it's 1 million, it's whatever. And that plays into sort of a circus that obscures the conversation that we need to be having about how these systems actually work and what outcomes they actually produce. And what we're seeing at the moment is that this circus being used to justify further clampdowns on the rights of migrants. So this has been something that's been ongoing for a long time. We've had Theresa May's hostile environment, which was designed to, well, the nominal purpose of it was to make undocumented migrants leave the country because conditions would be so poor for them. Now, if that really was the intention, it was the stated intention, but it failed in that. And there is absolutely no evidence that undocumented migrants left the country because conditions were made so difficult for them by the hostile environment. What there's plenty of evidence is that they were pushed further into conditions of precarity and vulnerability to exploitation by those policies. And that is, in the bigger picture, what is happening again and again. It's also what happened with the removal of the right to freedom of movement and Brexit. What we did was, as has been seen and has played out incredibly clearly, we did not reduce the number of immigrants coming to the country, but all the immigrants coming to this country no longer had the rights that Europeans enjoyed under the freedom of movement system, which included the right to come and go as they pleased, to settle down permanently, to live with their family members, to change employer and to challenge poor employer practices, to bargain for equal pay and higher pay, to unionize, all of these rights that allow people to basically join with other liberation struggles in this country and improve it for all of us, and improve conditions in particular for workers. And that right was taken away. It did belong to only a subsection of migrants previously to Brexit, and now it belongs to no migrants. And as we've seen, this did not reduce the number of migrants, just with the hostile environment, did not reduce the number of undocumented migrants. The end of freedom of movement did not reduce the number of migrant workers, but it did reduce their rights and put them into a position of greater precarity. And we're talking about that happening again and again and again. And at the same time as that is being pursued. So I think where that comes into, so Trump's obviously his big agenda of mass deportations, and how a lot of commentators in the UK are also bringing that politics over here. And there is more and more talk of deportations, both from the far right of our politics and their commentariat, but also from the government, which is touting its response to all of the issues around the failures of the immigration system as being, oh yeah, but we've increased deportations very significantly, right? So this language around deportations is growing. Now, yeah, they have increased the numbers of deportations very significantly, but actually from an incredibly low base, and not every deportation is an incredibly brutal and terrible thing that should not happen. But these are not very, very significant numbers. And that's because deportations continue to be very difficult to administer. And you need the cooperation of the state that you are sending migrants to. And this is going to be a huge block on the UK's ability to just get rid of vast numbers of people, and also on Trump's ability to do this. And we saw actually just this week, Mexico, for the very first time in, I think, like 2 decades, refusing entry to a deportation flight of Mexicans because of, presumably, although they haven't made a statement about it publicly that I've seen, but presumably because of the antagonism between Trump's administration and the Mexican government at the current time. So you can't just remove more people from the country because you say you're going to. And that is not to diminish the threat of what deportations mean, but it is to put it into the context of there is a theater of deportations, and the Trump regime and the British government are doing this on steroids, as many pictures and press releases about flights taking off when they do as possible. But that will always be a small part of the picture of what this wider enforcement narrative actually means for migrants' lives. And day to day, what that means is making migrants, whether they are undocumented or whether they have a precarious temporary status in the UK, or whether they simply are cowed by the consistent narrative of them being not belonging here and not deserving access to our services and so on. So thinking that they are not entitled to access services that in fact they are, this pushes them more and more into the margins of our society and puts them at greater and greater risk of that exploitation and abuse, whether that is through working in insecure gig economy contracts, in delivery, for example, or whether that is in even more extreme circumstances and actual situations of forced labor and trafficking. So that spectrum of abuse where employers are able to extract more value out of their workers and treat them less like human beings, and those human beings have less recourse to the support of the state. That is what is actually happening through this performance at this very sharp end of a few deportations, or of a few more deportations. And I think that that's really important, and you see it played out again and again. It's like how we focus so much on the small boats when that makes up like literally just a couple of % of what immigration really is to this country. You see it across Europe as well. You know, Giorgia Meloni has made an immense fanfare about sending literally a dozen people back and forth across the Adriatic to a detention center that she set up in Albania, and then they had to come back, and then they went back again, and there was another, like literally a handful of people have been sent back and forth in this performance. All the while, Italy's birth rate is at 1.2, and that is a literally catastrophically low level. And I think that there is a real failure in the wider public narrative to grasp what that means for the welfare state, right? Like that much of a shift in the dependency ratio towards older people who are in need of care, and there not being enough young, able-bodied people to work and provide the labor and provide the tax base to fund the welfare state, is utterly unsustainable. And it means that increasingly in Italy, and this is the case across Europe, but Italy is a very good example with a very hard right government doing this big performance about asylum seekers arriving there, all while desperately needing, and everybody who eats food in Italy is eating food picked and farmed by those migrants that are being, you know, targeted in this performance, and who are overwhelmingly employed in the grey economy without their rights protected. So I think, yeah, this point that Michael made was so important about how we focus on symbols to the detriment of examining what the actual underlying impact of these systems is. And I find a really good reaction from general public when I try to draw those links down to like, well, how does the system actually work? If we pursue more deportations, but we have a system that creates an undocumented migrant population because of the insecurity of the visa system that is baked in, then we will never come out of this cycle. We will always just be pursuing more people for deportation and have more people pass through this precarity of our visa system. It is the visa system as a whole that needs fundamental root and branch reform. So I feel like that is a narrative that is much more powerful than one talking about numbers or one that is sort of hedging our bets between, and I know that I end up doing this, but like, you know, about a humane asylum system, of course we do need a humane asylum system, but ultimately we need such a greater level of reform, and we need to shine much more of a light on how these systems are actually designed to extract more and more value from workers. And that is all to the benefit of the hyper rich in this society. And this comes around again to what we've been talking about with the oligarchy and how that supports Trump's politics, and how the Labour Party is trying to lean into that rather than leaning away from it, because it is all about consolidating this smaller and smaller group with an immense amount of wealth and privilege above us, and using migrants to divide us. So that was a hell of a rant, and I do want to come back to a few bits to maybe how can we be positive in the face of this? Well, actually, I think there is still, shockingly, a majority in this country for managing migration better. And like, there is still a majority in this country that when you move them away from the question of bigger numbers or smaller numbers, and actually to the question of how do these systems work, I think that there is actually quite a large majority for systems that just function on a simple level better to create an even playing field for people to access their rights in the workplace and to not end up pushed out into a situation of being undocumented. But of course, we don't have control over the media in order to, like, if you listen to the media narrative, obviously it doesn't sound like that majority exists. And so the power that we really do have is not reflected in a power over narrative. And I think that really does matter because, you know, obviously immigration has been moving up the scale of importance, like the salience, the importance that people give to it. And now it is back up among the top three, if not the top issue that people cite as being, you know, the most important issue impacting the country. But if you separate out that question between what is the issue that most impacts the country / what is the issue that most impacts me, immigration drops way down. And I mean way down to like 20th place in terms of what actually impacts me and my family. And what comes out on top, obviously, is access to healthcare, is the cost of living, is inflation, is the economy, right? So what I mean to say there is that, like, the power of narrative is incredibly important when we are discussing migration. We need to, there is some degree of understanding within the Labour Party that they need to address material conditions of people's lives, you know, access to services and the cost of living in order to confront the issue of migration, the issue of like concerns about migration that are really concerns about living standards. But the problem is that people know that migration isn't what affects them. And they have a wider idea of migration being a problem in and of itself outside of their day-to-day experience. And so just addressing material conditions isn't going to be enough. We also have to address the wider narrative, and we don't have control over mainstream media. Yeah, that's right. But I think it's come up already that, you know, what we as the left generally, and we as Another Europe, I think, need to do more and better. And I think even more rather than better, like just a lot more, is using social media and using TikTok and just putting out a lot more content onto those spaces because they are overwhelmingly dominated by right-wing narratives on migration right now. And I think that's a big part of the problem. So I've probably gone over my time. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing from the others on the panel and the discussion.
Thanks so much, Zoe. That was really brilliant. And we're really appreciating this shift from moving away from the symbols to looking at the systems and continuing that theme from the last session as well. And it was really interesting as well that you talked about the welfare state, because from my interest on like the colonialism background, obviously after the Second World War, the encouragement of migrants from Bangladesh, from the Caribbean, it was all about helping to rebuild Britain and the welfare state. And a lot of these people in their home countries don't have access to a welfare state in that way. And so that's just something that's quite interesting to me. But obviously, what you've raised, this question of who controls the narrative, means that these more in-depth conversations and ideas and understandings of migration often just get totally erased or don't get airtime. So yeah, how do we tactically shift it is a really important point. And now for the moment, Fatima is actually in a refugee camp in Western Sahara, which is why she's been having some internet problems. So hopefully she'll be back with us soon, but we can bring in Maritza Castillo-Cal, who is Vice President of the IWGB Union. And she can talk to us a bit more about how we organise people in the gig economy and fight back against the systemic oppression. So I'll pass it over to Maritza. And I know, Maritza, you said you had a translator?
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you for having today. So yeah, my English is not fluent, so I will use translation for this.
Yeah, so could you let us know who in the
okay, is Kate.
Great. And so perhaps you can do like you'll speak for a few sentences and then Kate will...
Yeah, Exactly. Yeah, thank you so
Okay.
much. Mi nombre es Marisa Castillo, yo soy la vicepresidenta del sindicato IWGB. Primeramente, me gustaría por agradecerles a hoy los que han organizado este panel, por invitarme a hablar. Es muy importante este evento y es un placer compartir con las demás speakers que hoy están hablando.
So, hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marisa Castillo, and I'm the Vice President of IWGB, our union. I would like to start by thanking the organisers for inviting me to speak at this important event, and it's a pleasure to be able to share this space with the other panelists today.
Para los que no conocen al sindicato IWGB, este es un sindicato que representa a trabajadores predominantemente migrantes, quienes trabajan en trabajos precarios y de bajos salarios, muchas veces para compañías subcontratadas, y de la economía G para compañías de aplicación como Uber, Delivery y entre otras. Somos un sindicato que lucha por la igualdad y en contra de la discriminación y la explotación laboral. Llevamos algunos años organizando y ayudando a mejorar sus condiciones mediante el empoderamiento y la organización colectiva en cada lugar de trabajo y en sectores que representamos a los trabajadores.
So for those of you who are not familiar with the IWGB union, it's a union that represents predominantly migrant workers who work in precarious, low-wage jobs, often for subcontracting companies, and in the gig economy for app companies such as Uber, Delivery, and others. So we're a union fighting for equality and against discrimination and labour exploitation. And we have been working for many years to improve working conditions through empowerment and collective organising in every workplace and sector that we represent.
Como sindicato nos posicionamos en su momento a favor de hacer campaña en contra de la salida del Reino Unido de la Unión Europea. Sabíamos que esto afectaría a nuestros miembros, especialmente dada la retórica anti-inmigración por parte de figuras políticas, y pensar para dividir el voto a favor de la salida. 5 años después, hemos visto el impacto del Brexit, donde ha generado un entorno hostil a los trabajadores de bajos salarios que sufren ataques en las calles a diario, aparte de los abusos que sufren día a día en sus lugares de trabajo por medio de los empleadores, quienes abusan de su estatus migratorio para violar sus derechos, discriminándolos y dividirlos porque saben que son vulnerables y no pueden reclamar o alzar su voz.
As a union, we took a stand at the time to campaign against the UK leaving the European Union, as we knew that this would affect our members, especially given the anti-immigrant rhetoric from political figures and the press to divide the vote in favour of leaving. So 5 years on, we've seen the impact of Brexit and how it's created a hostile environment for low-paid workers who often suffer attacks on the streets, as well as the abuse that they suffer daily in their workplaces by employers who abuse their immigration status to violate their rights and discriminate and divide them because they know that they're vulnerable and cannot complain or raise their voice.
La falta de mano de obra y la creación de visas temporales para llenar puestos de trabajo también ha puesto a muchos trabajadores, en la mayoría en riesgo de esclavitud y explotación, lo cual han salido a la luz en muchos casos como trabajadores siendo tratados de la peor manera sin que el gobierno haga mucho para protegerlos. Organizarlos es muy importante para nosotros, ya que mediante la organización colectiva y las campañas podemos visibilizar sus problemas y ayudarlos a que se respeten sus derechos y tengan la protección que necesitan y se les dé las condiciones y el respeto que se merecen estos trabajadores.
The lack of workforce and the creation of temporary visas to fill jobs has also put many workers at a greater risk of slavery and exploitation. And this has come to light in many cases, with workers being treated in awful ways and without the government doing much to protect them. Organising has become even more important, and through collective organising and campaigning, we can make these problems visible and help the workers to have their rights respected and to have the protection that they need, and the conditions and the respect that they deserve.
Actualmente hemos venido trabajando con algunas organizaciones que están ayudando a los inmigrantes como Settle, dándoles talleres y asesoramiento a los trabajadores inmigrantes para que puedan navegar el esquema del asentamiento Settle Scheme, para que puedan trabajar y puedan volver a reunirse con sus familiares. Hemos hecho campañas públicas cuando la policía ha hecho redadas junto a la Home Office de manera discriminatoria y racista para pedir papeles en las calles a trabajadores que trabajan como couriers, y también mediante nuestro departamento legal hemos logrado que haga justicia cuando los empleadores abusivos han intentado aprovecharse de la vulnerabilidad de nuestros miembros para violar sus derechos por cambio de sus estatus migratorios asociados con el Brexit.
So currently we've been working with organisations such as Settled to give workshops and advice to migrant workers so that they can navigate the settlement scheme in order to be reunited with their families and continue working. We have campaigned publicly when the police and the Home Office have behaved in discriminatory and racist ways through asking couriers to show documentation in the streets. Through our legal department, we have achieved justice when abusive employers have tried to take advantage of our members' vulnerability to violate their rights through Brexit-related changes to their immigration status.
Hay mucho trabajo por hacer. Nosotros vamos a seguir apoyando y ayudando a los trabajadores inmigrantes que están en este país y también que ayudan a la economía de este país, y necesitamos visibilizar sus problemas para que tomen acciones en contra de las empresas subcontratadoras. Esto es por mí. Thank you very much for inviting me.
So we know there's a lot of work to be done, and we look forward to your support in our struggles to visibilise the problems of the workers that we represent and to take action against these subcontracting companies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maritza. And I know it's not easy. We haven't had the interpretation the other way. Sorry, this was all kind of organised this morning. But this is a really, really important fight on the ground for migrant workers. And this is kind of a space which obviously it's open and easy for everyone to support and take part in a different way that the mainstream media is kind of blocked and like has all of its barriers to access. But this is a community-based organising that we can all support and help to improve the rights of workers on the ground, helping people win, factory by factory or like gig employer by gig employer. So thanks for that. Fatima at the moment is still not with us. Unfortunately, I think the electricity in the camp is not very good. I wanted to share an article about what she was going to be talking about. This is EU and Morocco cozy up on migration, green energy and Western Sahara. So I'm just going to post that article in the chat, and it goes into detail about some of the issues where there is a migration deal with the EU and Morocco, and there's this colonial aspect to it where Western Sahara is often described as Africa's last colony because it's quite a rich area of Morocco where there's the Western Saharan tribes who kind of claim that they should have sovereignty of that area, but it's got lots of resources and Morocco is kind of basically occupying it, and the EU is abandoning those human rights claims in order to have a deal with Morocco where they will push back migrants and maintain the border in a very militarized way. And then that region and the resources there are going to be used to develop Morocco's energy sector in a way that is also not compatible with the climate crisis. So I'll invite you to have a look at that article to find out in more detail about it and in a better way that I can speak about it. So thanks so much. And oh, Zoe, have you got your hand up?
Yeah, I just in Fatima's absence, I thought like maybe I could like say a few words about some of the other deals that the EU's been making and give a little bit of context to that. I'm sure it won't be at all as interesting as it would have been hearing directly from her, but thought it might be helpful.
Great, thanks so much, Zoe.
Yeah, so basically, this is a big part of the ambiguity of some of the campaigning that I think we do as sort of like left-wing Remainers. And our position on Brexit was always Remain and reform, right? And I think that like a really, really big part of the reform that we would have to do is to address Fortress Europe. So I don't actually know so much detail about the EU-Morocco deal that's being presented, apart from the fact that, yeah, it's true that Sahrawis, so people from Western Sahara are very often stateless, considered, well, they are stateless because their state is under occupation by Morocco, and especially Spain, which is really unfortunate because Spain does have more progressive migration policies in some angles. It has a terrible border policy, and it has a particularly bad policy towards Western Sahara, in particular because of its desire to cooperate with Morocco on detention and deportation. So it goes back to what I was saying about how you need the country that is receiving deportees to cooperate with you in order to actually enact deportations. And even better, from the EU states' perspective, than having to do deportations would be to have deals with the countries that surround Europe to have them prevent migrants from leaving in the first place, so that they never step onto European soil and therefore obtain the right to claim asylum. And this has been going on with Morocco, but also with, I have lost something here.
I think someone's just started screen sharing. Sarah, maybe you've accidentally started screen sharing. I will.
Hey, I'm back. That technology, isn't it fun? Sorry, Sarah. So yeah, yes, and these deals, we also have deals, the EU also has deals with Egypt and Libya and Tunisia, and it's actually really opaque to what degree the UK is involved with these deals, but don't think that we're not, right? So we have put 4 million, 400 million pounds just the other month via the Rome process, so via funding the Italian government, but that money is very opaque, but it's presumably going towards funding more of these deals. So the UK is still in really unclear and untransparent ways financially involved in these deals. And what these deals are doing in Tunisia and Libya are just literally horrific. I mean, obviously Egypt as well. These are countries where the state authorities are enacting torture on a systemic basis. I mean, I say state authorities, Libya doesn't even have a state. It just has a series of warring militias, some of whom we pay. And there was a recent set of videos that came out of some of the torture cells in Libya where migrants from sub-Saharan Africa are held and tortured while their families are kept on the phone to hear that torture going on, and so that they are coerced to pay a ransom for those migrants' release. This is being directly funded, and I do mean directly funded by the EU and indirectly funded by the UK. In Tunisia, there have been state authorities just rounding up Black sub-Saharan Africans and dumping them in the Sahara Desert without anything, any water, any food, any mobile phones, any means of support. And there have been images of dozens and dozens and dozens of bodies of men, women, and children who have died of exposure in the Saharan Desert. This is how the EU is creating partnerships to prevent migration from happening. And of course, it doesn't work. Yes, of course, it breaches the Convention on Torture. Of course, it breaches every single human rights obligation that we have. It also breaches any semblance of human morality that anybody could have. But it really does speak to the sort of out of sight, out of mind element of this. And another thing that Michael mentioned, which is about, increasing displacement caused by climate change that is inevitable in our future, and how this is going to be dealt with, and whether we are going to care when we see more and more bodies pile up. And the current trajectory looks like we won't. But I think, again, maybe the best way to fight against this, even though it sounds awful, is economic. Like, this is an incredible waste of money. Waste of money. I mean, it sounds sick to say it when we're paying for torture and murder, but that isn't working, right? We need people. We have this demographic need for people, and people are coming anyway. So I think that there is an argument that can be made that money should be being spent in our communities, and possibly that's, I don't know, it sounds really sick to say it, but possibly that's an effective way of getting through to some people who apparently are unmoved by, and you can literally just watch videos of this torture happening. I mean, I don't really recommend it, but you can. But as we all know, with Palestine as well, you can see images of atrocities. It doesn't provoke change. So we need to find different ways to talk about it. But yeah, I think it's too bad that Mo wasn't here. I'd have loved to hear from her, but this is a really, really big part of the equation that, is again obscured by the theater of, this big, oh, it's a deportation flight, or Trump said this, or Musk's done this Nazi salute. This is what's really, really happening, and it's all about economics and as you said, Seema, as well, sort of this neo-colonialist relationship that Europe has with the rest of the world as well.
Thank you so much, Zoe, for stepping in there. And I think there's so much to say about this. This is only kind of the first meeting that we'll have on this topic. We'll definitely have more meetings, and most importantly, thinking about ways that we can act on this. And hopefully Fatima can join us in the future another time, and others who are, living the realities of this every day. So what we can do now is move on to have a bit of discussion. There's 10 minutes left for this session. I see Julie's raised your hand, so feel free to come in on this.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm really glad, Zoe, right at the end of that presentation, you talked about the money, the economic argument, if you like. So I'm involved in a campaign called No to Hassockfield, which is trying to shut down a detention centre in the northeast of England, in rural County Durham, that was set up. It was actually, the site was taken back into the detention estate during COVID, so there was no scrutiny, basically, by the government, and the local authority, Durham County Council, had already earmarked the site for social housing and a pocket park, and then under cover of COVID took back the site. It's actually now known as Derwentside Immigration Removal Centre, but our campaign is called No to Hassockfield because the centre was previously Hassockfield Training Centre for Boys, and before that it was Medhamsley Detention Centre. And some of you who've got long memories might know the history of the site. It was a site of historic abuse, and about 5 former employees were eventually jailed for the historic abuse of the boys that were incarcerated there. In our campaign, so I'm going to put a link up about this, but in our campaign, where we demonstrate outside the centre on the 3rd Saturday of every month, and we've been doing that now for since July 2021, so that's a very long time, and our campaign will continue until we close it down. We've basically made ourselves incredibly knowledgeable about the whole situation from every single angle. So our website has a lot of information on it. So first of all, talking about the economics of this is really, really important. It's a private company, right, who are Tory donors. It's now Serco, but it used to be run by Mighty. And these people are just creaming off huge, huge profits. And they have these mega contracts with the government, and they're paying shit wages to the people who work there. So I do think this narrative needs to be explored, and we need to find ways of talking about it and explaining it, because when people know it's public money, it's our money, and yet we haven't got enough for schools, enough for hospitals, enough for roads, all the rest of it, then I think people hopefully will start to care. But there was also an alternatives to detention pilot that ran under the Conservative government. It's unbelievable to think about this, but under the Conservative government with UNHCR, there was two pilots that took place, one up in Newcastle with Action Foundation and one in Buckinghamshire. And both of them proved that alternatives to detention are cheaper, more humane. These are about community alternatives generally. So people who are going through their asylum process, actually living in the community and being supported by the community and not being re-traumatized by detention. So I'll put a link up about that, about our campaign. Please sign up for the emails, and when we have our national demos, please come up and participate. We're part of a network of campaigners across the country who are taking action around this. And then the other thing, very briefly, is that if you don't already know about the list, which is a list of all the refugees, all the people who've died trying to reach the shores of Europe, including people who've died in detention in this country. It's a list that's curated by an organisation that I volunteer with. It's called United for Intercultural Action, and it's a very powerful document to give people, and it continues to be updated. It's actually an artwork. It was printed in The Guardian when it was first created. It was put on the walls of Blackie in Liverpool for the biennial, where it was defaced twice, and the second time it was defaced, they left it there to basically show the work we have to do in our communities to counter this horrendous racism. So it was a bit of a speech, that, rather than a question, but it would have been a question, Zoe, if you hadn't talked about the economic cost of detention and our system.
Thanks so much, Julie, for giving some examples of these concrete solidarity efforts on the ground. And we definitely can talk about them more in the next session, which is all about discussion. And we have a migration heading that we'll be discussing as part of our campaign strategy. I'll take a couple more and then we'll go back to Maritza, and then we'll have a break so people can have lunch and we can continue this discussion after. So the next hand was Robbie Bentley.
Hi. Quite a lot of you will know that I'm already actually studying a lot of this matter, and the ethical point that we're actually making in here is clearly based on the fact that this country is continuing, as it has, unquestioningly to follow the principles of might makes right, in direct contradiction to what Lee Weiner said to Audrey Carville on BBC Radio Ulster back in 2016, and which is the subject of my current assignment at the Open University. We really need to move away from the Singer doctrine, okay, in respect of this. And sorry to take this into a slightly more academic element, but the argument does need to be made, okay. They're allowing it on air, but we're not actually embracing it. I think we do need to embrace it.
Thanks, Robbie. And the next hand I saw was Alena, I think.
Yes, although I'm conscious that I'm taking away some time from other discussions. I did have a question. So I'm wondering, Zoe, and I'm sorry if I'm taking this kind of conversation in a slightly very specific sort of direction, but given this was a part of a conversation earlier in the chat while we were having the first session, and it was all around these kind of different perceptions of different groups of people that need protection, and what we're doing for Ukrainians, what we're not doing for Palestinians, and all of that kind of line of thinking. Do you find it kind of useful as a framing to focus on these particular moments in time and use the extreme examples that we're seeing in both of those conflicts of people kind of needing safety to make a general argument? Or do you think in the longer term it's more productive for us to focus on these kind of localized and community-based messaging, saying, you know, these are our neighbors, these are the parents of the kids that go to our schools, and we get free school meals and they don't get free school meals. I guess what I'm trying to say is, while we retain our very much kind of internationalist politics, is the framing of these big global conflicts actually helping us or causing damage when we talk about a more humane approach to migration?
Thanks, Alena. I'll just go to David for one more quick comment, and then we'll come back to Zoe and Maritza.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, we hear you.
Okay. Yes, I just wanted to say, you talked about, Zoe, I think, talked about the different narratives, and that the main narrative by the media is on numbers. I think that is a big slice of it. But what we've been seeing lately is a narrative which is even more explosive and toxic than the numbers narrative, which is a narrative about grooming gangs and stuff like that. It's interesting that that's been an issue which Tusk has played a leading role in moulding and bringing it, and that's sort of been followed now by the Tories and a theme in the media. So, and I think it's important because the consequences can actually, when we've seen them on the streets, can be really violent, and it's a really scary narrative that's being developed there.
Thanks, David. This is really important, and it links a lot into the Islamophobia work that we've been doing as well, which is we need to think a bit about how we build that into the narrative too, and how we engage people more to defend both Muslims and migrants on these issues. So what I'll do is I'll bring this back to Maritza first, and then Zoe, and then we can go on the lunch break. I know we've run over time a bit. So Maritza, if you're still there.
Sorry, Maritza just messaged me that she had to run.
Okay, that's all right then.
So you're left with me, guys. But yeah, thank you. Right, really tricky questions, which are the best ones. On the grooming gangs thing, yeah, I genuinely think like it's very difficult. I think the reason why it exploded so much is that it's like been a background sort of narrative that has existed in, frankly, racist groups for a really long time. So they saw this opportunity to make it huge frontline news with Musk, and absolutely not to underplay the just disgusting nature of it all and the impacts that it's had. But I think when we're confronting that, it is really important to remind ourselves that Twitter is not the UK. It wasn't the UK when it lent more left-wing either, sadly, but it's definitely not the UK now. And a huge amount of the amplification of that narrative and why it got so big was it didn't reflect the fact that this was all of a sudden an actual core concern of the majority of British people. And while everybody in Britain is revolted by, stories of exploitation and sexual abuse of children, I think that there is a core far right and racist group that's particularly that law around Pakistani grooming gangs, alleged, speaks to very much. And it was more opportunistic than it was reflective of more widespread feeling, which is much more nuanced than that came across. And that's not to say that we can ignore it. We obviously can't. But I think that we need to talk about how, and I think most people can relate to this, that it makes us a lot less safe if you put, basically, if you use a racist scapegoat in place of the real efforts that need to be undertaken to keep people safe from crime. And I think that narrative, takes seriously people's fears around the real horrific crimes that do occur, but also points out very clearly how not only is this narrative that's built that it's, you know, all done by a certain demographic is wrong, but also that actively makes us less safe. And I think we should be pushing back and saying, like, for our own safety, for the safety of our children and our communities, we need this to be looked at as the criminal issue that it actually is, and not as a race issue. And I think that really the best that the migration sector can do on that is like just not we would never lead on a conversation about grooming gangs at all. Like, you know, you have to respond to it when it's that big in the media, but it is not our ground to talk about, because it's not a migration issue. Like, the vast majority of the people accused in any case were British, and I think that there is a really, really clear you know, we saw this in the case of, you know, the Stockport, isn't it? The murders of those little girls, you know, like Southport, thank you, is the narrative that basically non-white British people are connected to migration more and more so. And obviously this is like with the fundamental racism being of the anti-migrant movement, but it is about othering and saying, like, well, if your parents were migrants, then you essentially count, like, if you commit a crime, then you essentially count as migrant crime. Like, this is like something we really, really need to be strongly taking on in the narrative, right? Because it's so blatantly racist, and it is no longer strong enough to say that something is racist, because that's become much more okay. Like, let's be real, it has become much more okay to be racist in our society nowadays. And so we also need to say, like, it's not just racist, but the fact that it is racist is bad for these reasons, right? And we're actually at that stage of having to explain it. And one of the reasons is that it does make us less safe if we take a racist approach to policing crime. So I hope that was helpful. Also, that was a bit confusing even in my own head. On Alena's question, I think it's a really, really thorny one about, like, how do we use or talk about, like, big political events, global events, when we're trying to promote better policies towards migration and refugees. I think there's some evidence that when people hear about a war or a disaster or whatever, their initial response is one of generosity towards the people fleeing, and that bit by bit that reduces. And that it remains the case whether those are people, say, you know, the people displaced by the LA fires, for example, like other Americans, how they respond to them, or whether they're foreign people coming into your country. It basically, essentially, just initially the shock means you feel like you have to help, and then the fear comes that there's only this much and they're going to need more and more. And I think that the real big issue does come back to numbers there, because the fear behind talking about these huge wars and displacement events is that it reinforces this idea of this, like, endless sea of huge numbers of people who need. And so I think that a really good thing to respond to that is definitely to keep it local, to talk about our need. So if you can localize that need, all the better. Like, our local care home is in desperate need of people to come and work here. Like, emphasizing that the need does not just happen on one side, but we need people. Like, that is just, if I have one slogan that I'm going to try to push, like, people move and we need people, right? We do desperately need these people just as desperately as they need us, is really important. And then also, I think that with Ukraine in particular is actually quite a good example in terms of the numbers, because the Ukraine scheme was totally uncapped, right? You have a country of 38 million people, and as many of them as wanted had a safe route to safety in the UK, to access to the welfare state. And listen, I know there have been real problems with the Ukraine scheme, and there has been a lot of hardship with some of the Ukrainians who have come here, and their situation now is quite precarious. But as a top line comms thing, right, you can point to a country of 38 million people who were given an uncapped ability to come here and escape from a bloodthirsty dictator's rampage through their country, and 200,000 of them came, and we managed it. And it's actually quite a strong sort of counter to the idea that there is, like, an immense horde of people just waiting to come. If you create a safe route, then there will be too many people. That is the real fear that even, I think, reasonable people who care about refugees have, and that we really strongly need to counter.
Thanks so much, Zoe. A great way to end this session. We are going to take a 15-minute break, I would say, and then we'll come back and we can keep having this discussion because the next part of our AGM is about you and your contributions and our campaign strategy. So I'll see you in 15 minutes, which will be in UK time 1:45. Okay.